Welcome to Command and Control, a podcast series about military command and the control measures used to orchestrate combat engagements and wars. In the last season, we talked a lot about command, dabbled in control, but took a largely tactical, land-centric view of C2. In this season, I wanted to focus a little more on the higher levels of C2, operational art, the political-military interface from both sides, and of course, to tip our lances to some of the windmills of contemporary doctrine. I'm Peter Roberts, your host. Join me as we try to understand some more of this topic. Now, my concern about our failure to understand the control facet of C2 hasn't gone away. So if you'll indulge me, I will try and get our guest to illuminate the dark space that is the intellectual void around this element of C2. I'm delighted to say that the show is once again sponsored by Systematic.
Systematic's world-leading command and control software, the Citaware suite, is in use in 16 NATO countries and more than 50 militaries worldwide. Its open architecture allows complete integration with legacy systems while meeting all NATO interoperability standards, and its intuitive interface bridges language and domain barriers across alliances.
So for the last week, I've been in The Hague at the Command and Control Centre of Excellence for NATO, answering to the Supreme Allied Commander transformation. The C2 COE is a rather strange construct. Funded by the Dutch government and working to NATO, it doesn't take direction from NATO commanders, but instead holds a sort of semi-independent mandate. Over the last few days, the COE team convened and executed an event calling on C2 experts from across the alliance, but also those from a diverse set of backgrounds, from former commanders, scholars, industrialists, technologists, human behaviour specialists and researchers. It made for a demanding audience and a challenging set of sessions, for which there was no real set of driving questions. But there was a hypothesis from the start designed to agitate and provoke the audience and participants. That idea that NATO commanded decision-making is simply not good enough was a continuing theme throughout the sessions over the past 3 days. Some of the best 3 days that I've had in recent memory. Most of the participants stayed throughout, a good thing, as the content just kept getting better and better. Conducted in partnership with the Canadian Warfare Centre and with almost no US personnel present, it engendered a freedom to speak across the community that gathered. 3- and 4-star officers spoke about their expectations and challenges during command appointments. More junior personnel shared their experiences about leaders they've worked for, and we explored the ideas of leading and followership. I thought you'd be interested to hear about what was discussed over the past few days, so I asked the conference convener and commander of the C2 COE, Colonel Mietta Groeneveld, to join me in a hot wash-up. And when I say hot, I mean we only finished the event about 90 minutes ago. Mietta, it's quite difficult. We've not had a chance to roll around in some of the content and what was said, right? But the content and speakers were just incredibly diverse. I mean, in background, nationality, rank, area of expertise, the industry, the scientists. It was amazing. How did you manage to pull all these people together to select the speakers and persuade some of the good and the great to come along, right?
Yeah, first of all, I think it's very important to understand that if you are in a very complex world and you talk about command and control, you can't do that with a not diverse audience. So it's always been my idea, and I've been able to go to very interesting conferences myself in the past 2 years since I've been director of the NATO Command and Control Centre of Excellence. And then you meet a lot of people that are very interesting, and I listen a lot to other podcasts, and then I think, okay, this actually is adding to this idea. And then I reached out to those speakers and trying to persuade them to come and join us in this conference. And I think being NATO, talking about NATO command and control is just a huge selling point in and of itself at this moment, as everybody really would like to support NATO to get this right. We want to get it right. And so there's no persuasion needed at all whatsoever to get people.
But there is a need to select, right? Because we had 2.5 days. I think you selected some of the most interesting speakers I've heard in a long time. I knew quite a lot of them. Generally, there were some people that were off the wall I never heard of before. And genuinely, they opened my eyes. The most intellectually engaging conference I've been to in months, if not years. How do you pull those threads? Is it just purely your judgment? Is it your team? How do you sort of pull that through?
Yeah, it is, of course, a combination of those. We also, in the team of the NATO C2 COE, we have a diverse group as well. And they engage and they have contacts. as well as we've got reservists in, for instance, that have contacts outside of the military. And I have also a technical background, so I've been in the scene of industry. And we've been talking in the scene of industry, working together with the military. And they, of course, since the AI and the challenges that come with this are so profound, and we see that when you talk C2, you also talk about being able to communicate and being able to connect. And these things are very closely related to industry. So I think we need to involve industry, and we need then also to make a division between what industry are we talking about. Because industry is not just one group. For me, we have the defense-related industry, the primes, and they typically are in the business where they would ask you sometimes, tell me what you need in 10 years, give me the money to go with it, and we'll start developing it. And of course, on the other hand, we see now that on the civil industry side, things are moving so fast that we've seen in the past week that people are really scared that technology is going to so fast that we need to get a hold on it. And so these things don't really come together. And the industry that is in this fast moving part is not typically military industry, it's global industry. It's not definite. So the military industry is also related to nations, whereas I think the more global industry is not related to nations that much and should be seen as an entity in and of itself. So when we work together with those industries, and we need them, because there's no doubt about it, that if we are wherever we want to, that we will work together with civil partners and industries for everything we need. We can't do this on our own anymore.
Right, but all that strong presence from industry, some great people along right at the conference, yet I think with one exception, I'm not sure I heard any of them say that technology was going to be the answer, right? I don't know if that was your takeaway too, but to me it was like, for them, even they were saying, listen, tech is an enabler to C2. Don't make it your driving force. I don't know. Did you get that impression as well?
That would be my answer also. But I think the point is not that tech is not the answer. Tech has already solved all the problems that we are still talking about. So what I would say is that it's really important to understand that tech is not there to just innovate our prehistoric battlefield. So it's not us having the same structures and the same organization and the same task, and then industry coming in and making that a little bit better. That is just mediocre development. Whereas this technology also enables you to really rethink what your threats are, rethink also how you can organize yourself, how you can go about. Just thinking of a headquarters. I mean, it's not just getting the data best assessed and then giving that to some person and they will then sit together and do some synchronization and put it in a PowerPoint. I mean, these things can be done simply by technology, and that will free us up to really focus on the tasks that we have.
The conversations that I had with people from all over Europe in particular, right? Well, a lot of it was about how do they play catch up? How do they get on board with the sufficient pace of technological change that, for example, the US are talking about? The digitization in some of the major players, the French, the Brits, they're off in one direction. The Germans are even talking about it. And actually for the Slovaks, the Latvians to play catch up in some of this stuff, it's a major ask, right? And I just worried about that differentiation between how people are progressing down this path and potentially not just having a multi-speed NATO, but a multi-speed NATO in C2 terms, that ends up being hugely to our detriment.
Yeah, that's probably right. So what I see sometimes is that we focus too much on getting it completely right, making sure that everything is connected. And then that takes years. Whereas I would say, well, why would you want to get everything right? Why does everything needs to be connected? That's not true. So it's not about connecting every sensor to every shooter across NATO. When I would talk to a technical person, that's the way he would think, or she. But I think it's about understanding that it is the way that all the simple tasks already, the technology is out there, we should start using it. I mean, in my organization, we've had all the logistical processes, all the financial processes, and all the people processes. We have them in one system. We have all the data. I've never seen one single decision really been taken on the analysis that would have been available since 10 years. So I sometimes say it's simply not good enough anymore not to make use of the things that you already have, or not to understand that it's not okay anymore to talk about 1 million if you're not aware that somewhere else in your organization you're spending 1 billion, and not have a conversation on it. So I think that's just the money-wise, but it's also for command and control. So you want to talk about the things that really, really matter, specifically when it really gets to a fight. You really want to talk about the things that really matter, and don't waste your time on the stuff that doesn't really matter. And so I think it's out there, the technology is there, and the technology is evolving really, really fast. We have a problem within our organization to get that technology fast enough. That's another discussion that we could have. It's about the procurement process. But basically it comes to, if you do what you did, now you will get what you got. And that is, if three things are changing, if you keep your organization the same, and you keep the hierarchy the same, and the organizational structure the same, and the capabilities the same, well, yeah, then
you're on a hiding to nothing, right? And yeah. I think that was how we ended the discussion, was a differentiation of C2 models across the alliance. And you talked about this, and I want to ask you to reiterate it. In previous series, I talked to Mick Reiner, to Jack Watling, about how the Ukrainians had adapted and evolved their C2 structure, both for offense and for defense, as their size grew, depending what operation they were doing. They morphed and adapted their C2 structures in a really fluid and dynamic way. You said something at the end of the event here about NATO's conundrum that made a one-size-fits-all approach in C2 terms appear almost nonsensical. If you can summarize that.
Yes, so I'll try it. So when I look at NATO, we sometimes assume, okay, all kinds of C2, that's all about fighting kinetically. But when we look at NATO is basically three things. It has a headquarters structure that will be in place to do a kinetic fight or a multi-domain fight when we will have a war and when we will have an Article 5. Then it has basically another structure that will bring together politicians and push policy among those 31 nations in order to be deterrent, to talk about it together. Let's create NFIUs. Let's exercise as much as we can along the border. Can we do participating air forces? Where can we work together in order to show this posture that will be deterrent? And that's a policy process where we try to work together with all those nations to get the deterrent out and to have a campaign on that and to work together to never get to this Article 5, never ever. And then below that, I think it's also an education and training and standardization organization that will enable us to share and educate and train as much as we can together, and to get so that we will be enabled that if we are in an operation together, that we are able to do that together. And that will be not always, or mostly not, an organization that will be under NATO command. It probably is a coalition of the willing. And then mandate matters. So when does NATO have a mandate? Well, NATO has a mandate that is defined with Article 4, but I don't think NATO ever will have the mandate in Europe to completely lead. So the military will not be completely in the lead. I think it will always be on the national side. So when you look at the mandate for military action, it is defined in our constitutions what the role of the military is and what the military would have as a mandate in the nation that you are operating in. So that is important to have a look at. And so if you see then in the domains, you see that when we are at sea, there's the law of the sea. It's free for all, so we already have a mandate. So we see when we look with a Navy perspective to it, we already are in operations and we have mandate to do things, even now in NATO. And that would also be the case in space. It's debatable about cyber, but cyber is not nation-linked, I'd say. It is nation-linked in the way that when you want to go to proactive cyber defense, then there will be regulations that are nationally or European-wide that will hold you accountable if you are doing things that you're not supposed to do. And when you go to the land domain, that is specifically nation way. So there is no mandate most of the time in the land domain for NATO to operate unless the nation has invited us to.
And enabled it, right?
And enabled it.
And therefore, what you come up with is a series of different C2 structures, one to do the sort of deterrence mission. Maybe parts of that does the current ops stuff, which is enhanced forward presence, is policing, is some of the standing naval force stuff that's going on, that also does training and education. You then get the stuff that is a completely different structure, right? Yeah. For the sort of Article 5, we failed at deterrence. Yeah. This is what we have to do, which is the warfighting area. And then that has a series of structures, which then needs to be the policy interaction with the nations, but also there needs to be a military strategic headquarters that runs operations. At the moment, you've just got a big structure that's just trying to do it all, right?
I think I wouldn't credit it enough. I think that these structures are there, but it's always difficult for us from an outside point of view sometimes to understand everything because it's very complicated, I think. What is very interesting now, of course, I think when we are changing all our forces with this speed, it's really vital that we have an ongoing conversation with all these different constructs. So it's also about how is now the national C2 structured, and those will be different in those 31 nations. Some nations have, when we do a more or less whole of society fight, because we also brought in cyber and we brought in space, and those are those more difficult domains where there's a lot of civil entities in it. And I think then when we look at the plans that NATO has ready to be able to act today, it's always about the conversations with those nations because they deliver the troops. So you would like to go about at the same tempo. And specifically, if you are changing, you need to change your force quickly because you see that our adversaries and our threats are getting more complicated and are changing as well. So if we want to outpace, outthink, out-excel them, we need to increase our change of transformation. So it's not about just transforming one time. It's about having a constant transformational speed. And that should go hand in hand between NATO and the nations to be actually effective on all levels of that C2 structure.
I guess the struggle I have with this is I get that you need to change. You need to change your structure. The Ukrainians have showed us that the failures for the IDF in Israel attacks back in October, they were the same way, the failures to adapt it. So you need that, right? You can call this transformation, but you need to be going somewhere. You need to be changing into something. And I just wonder if we don't have that identified because we've got a myriad of signals, demand signals on the headquarters to go there. Can we just afford just to keep transforming almost for the sake of transforming and not with a purpose in mind? Like, so I want JFC, whatever, to transform itself and make it a warfighting headquarters that will deal with operations in Northern Europe. That means that we don't have to cut people out and change them across from JEF to NATO. Do we not need to have like a headmark that says, this is where I'm going? Or do we have to be sufficiently intellectually agile to go, yeah, it's all going to be a bit of a mishmash. And when it comes to it, we'll figure it out.
I agree with you that all the time transformation costs a lot of time, money, intellectual power. So that is probably not what I'm getting at. Perhaps we should not so much change our structures all the time or our people all the time. What we can change is our understanding of things, because that actually doesn't require that much of work or an effort. And I think that is something we are obliged to do, to be good enough. If you really feel this sense of urgency, and I feel a sense of urgency, because I do feel that currently things are getting a little bit out of, or not going into the right direction. And because of that sense of urgency, I would really like everybody to get not only engaged in the things that we always did, but also get them really engaged in the thinking, and without making it an organizational change immediately again, without, buying the stuff first or getting it all right. No, just start doing this incremental changes, perhaps, so that different mindset would already help a lot. And the connections that you can make and think outside of your box. When we have a look at the new MDO concept of NATO, which is actually pretty good, I think, and it talks to reach converging effects in all environments. And it makes a clear distinction when you look at those effects in those environments, that those environments are the physical environment, the cognitive environment, and the virtual environment. And we tend to think in the physical environment. So our mind switch to think more about effects and the effects that we can reach in the cognitive environment would already be very helpful. I think when it is about synchronizing all military activities, and so coordinating all military activities, synchronized with all non-military activities in all instruments of power, which is also in this concept, then it becomes really interesting, because then you can't say, it's just the military. Let's not talk to all these other entities. And that's why I think the role of industry is not the role of industry providing us with kits. It's also us understanding that we are in this construct where we need to work together with industry, with government, with other entities. And that is not something that we just start doing when things went wrong, because we need to do that as a natural thing.
Right, and we might have to come back and do a separate episode about that, because whilst we covered sort of a whole of society approach right at the end, very powerful addresses from Finland and Sweden and the Hybrid Warfare Centre of Excellence, really, really powerful stuff coming out there. Actually, if we go back to the majority of the conference, one of those themes that came out was talking about decision-making paradigms and organizational change doctrine, which referred to both the sort of headquarters, the C2 headquarters, and the people themselves, the commanders. And we never sort of divided out talking about the process and the commanders, but we never individualized it either. It was a far more inclusive approach than nailing individuals and going, sack your, sack T, this is how we think you're performing. I found it really helpful. The stuff that we had on decision-making paradigms, I thought was really challenging and very helpful.
I think it's interesting, because when we thought of what are we going to bring in this conference, we thought, okay, let's have it about command. And then, of course, you see that the assumption is pretty quickly made that command is about this one person in the top, that we're talking about the commander, because he's the one doing command. Well, that's an odd assumption, because I think command is a much broader perspective. And we know, we had somebody from McKinsey and explaining a little bit, okay, the basic stuff of a good decision, the basic stuff of how you perhaps are in a team and the decision maker is not always the one at the top. That could be the coordinator. In my nation, actually, our prime minister has a little bit of that role, and we have separate ministries that have strong votes in it. So it doesn't always have to be that there's only one person that takes a decision. And probably that's also when you go to this more of whole of society approach, nobody is really in the lead. So now we need to learn how we can strengthen that collaborative action or that collaborative effort of our staff, of our whole staff, of our command, to really command together and get a unity of effort out that goes beyond the military sometimes. But if you keep it to the military side, then within such a headquarters, you want to get away a little bit from the perspective where you bring it still in this hierarchical system to one person to decide, because that is a system where you think one person is the only one that has the best oversight and knowledge. Whereas I would like to see a staff perhaps a little bit more, and it is perhaps needed a little bit more, to see it as there is so much complexity. So you need so many knowledgeable people that you should realize that there will never be one person that can impersonate all this knowledge. So perhaps your decisions can be taken by different people depending on what you're talking about.
It was really interesting, right, when we talked about dividing out decisions, the high risk, high reward decisions that had to be taken by the commander, and then everything else down below, and how you make better decisions was really interesting. One of the things that came out for me, and we had a lot of contrarians in the room, right? People who just disagreed. It was brilliant. It made him such an engaging group of people. But to have the Maverick next to the commander, not necessarily as the chief of staff, but to have someone empowered that the commander would then accept, that would say, if you do this, here's how it could go really badly wrong. Or the assumptions that you're making in order to get to that decision are these. Are you happy with these assumptions, right? Because I think they're mad. And that idea of putting the contrarian, the Maverick, not only on the staff, but alongside the commander, the evidence was there that this is something that would bring out better decisions. I don't know many commanders who would be willing to accept that, not on every occasion, but for those important high-risk decisions, right?
Well, we had talked to a lot of high-level commanders as well, and I think what came out of that also showed that if you want to be successful, you probably have that. But I would go a little bit further than just having the Maverick. It's also the assumption, maybe in our military organization, where we just focus on this one person that must take decisions that are about life and death. Whereas I think our effort is actually not about ultimately just taking the decisions on life and death, but it's also preventing that we are going to do that. And it's when you take into cyber and go to this much broader perspective, and you have this whole military organization, then 99% of your time you are actually in different positions. And you need to look at not just selecting. So how do you select those commanders? Because if you're just selecting them on the characteristics they would need for such a life and death decision making, it would also make a difference. Like when you are in a KOC and you are doing that for the Air Force, that's a different thing than when you are at sea and you're in a monitoring mission and you want to be diplomatic and you are aware of your geopolitical consequences that come with that as well. Whereas you are in the land domain and you are surrounded by civil society and civilians, and you need to go about in a different way. So I think even when you look at your operational commanders, but also to make sure that you are in this continuum of crisis, actually as a whole, look at the set and how you select the people that are leading this. And come to technical side, and that would be a little bit of my background. I miss sometimes the technological knowledge, because I think the assumptions that we make on technology are still sometimes a little bit uninformed. So yes, we can say it's all about the human. Yes, we can say they can take over, but unfortunately, that is not good enough.
There were some really good points that came out on that about empowering, about followership, about leadership, even about NCO command and the technical ability and taking that up. The conversations that we had about that gave me real hope that there was a group of people here that really understood the idea about how we train and how we continue to train, constantly train and retrain commanders, select them, make them right. And yet for NATO to take this on is like a huge step. I mean, the recommendations you could make from this would be pretty difficult for NATO to swallow in some ways.
So perhaps we should not be talking that much NATO as a concept. So NATO is a platform where you would like to enable nations also to learn from each other and work from each other. So what I try to do as well, I would like to show the best cases. And so we know that in the UK, they are sometimes on some points really far ahead. We must enable to share that so you can copy paste it and don't have to do it yourself again. So please share good ideas and look at other nations. We must multinationalize our thinking in this. So if you are way too inward thinking, I think if you want to get to MDO, multi-domain operations, the thing to start with is never to develop your own doctrine, never to develop your own SOPs, bring together always multinationality in it, look at other nations. And if you are developing permanent joint headquarters, there is now a set of nations working on permanent joint headquarters, and it would be a pity if you wouldn't go and have a look and then get those great ideas that are already out there and use them. So you are jump-started to, as I said, where you free yourself your time, and also on the development of people. This is all about people. So we are so much in the military skewed to talk about organizational things and our, I would like to say toys, but hey, our toys. So you would need to buy what you need on the day that you need it. Stop talking too much about that. The strength is us. So I was in Afghanistan. I was really, really proud of all the Dutch people I was there with, and also the multinationality that we had in Afghanistan. We had 22 nations in TAC North where I have been. And I realized that the Netherlands, I'm not sure whether I should say it too loud, but we had the oldest clothes, and we were explaining, but it didn't matter because we actually had really, really, really good people. And we were working with German material. We were relying on Georgians to do the gate. And if you're in this environment, it is really about the way you teach your people to be able to conduct together. And the strength is more in what they are able to do themselves than it is in the kit they have and the connectivity they have, because that we will provide them.
I get where you come from. I sort of struggle with this idea when we relate it back to Afghanistan and C2, given that we lost. And we had a numerical advantage, we had a weapon system advantage, we had an intelligence advantage, we had technological advantage in generational terms, we had freedom of the skies, freedom of cyber. The only EW war we were fighting was with ourselves, and we were beaten by a bunch of people riding around on horseback, firing World War II weapons and building bombs in mud huts. The C2 cannot have been that good in order to get us there. The lessons from Afghanistan, we might have learned a lot about making our people better, but that didn't necessarily get us anywhere with our commanders, right?
I agree. So I would say what I just talked about was not about the operational level C2. I think if you're a carpenter, everything looks like a nail. And so it's really, really important if you look at this C2 cycle and you'd like to say, hey, what was the effect? What is actually my mission? It's just like COVID. I mean, we got COVID. All of a sudden, we had to decide, our governments had to decide within 1 second to send everybody home. Hey, that's good. Good to go for the first 2 weeks, perhaps. But then you need to assess whether the actions that you have taken are still valid and what are the effects. So then you need to start measuring. Okay, they did that in COVID. They started to measure how many people are in hospital, how many people died. But then we saw that sending everybody home had multiple effects. And if your task is actually as a government to keep the nation stable and safe, and you need to think about much more variables than just people in hospital. And you can't just only ask that of your senior physician. So what I want to say is when you have an operational mission, you have to start somewhere and you need to act. So you're going to start with an assumption and you're going to put out your campaign. But then you also need to assess and go back to your mission and think, okay, am I actually reaching my goal? And then if you are then assessing, well, perhaps we are still not really there, your assessment could be, let's go even more to it. Or you could change perhaps and not only use wood as your solution. So what I mean with that, I think in the operational session, we only looked at the military means, whereas we had a complex whole of society mission in Afghanistan. And if we focus too much just on actions, and all of us are saying, well, yeah, the whole of the mission, that's too much for me as a commander, so I'm just going to focus on this small part that I'm about. But we all know that we actually should look up in our intent as well. So you can't just say, well, I did a little bit better than my predecessor because I actually threw more bombs. What is that? That's just the way you do it. That wasn't about the effect. So we need to think more in effects.
And that's interesting because that did come out of the conference. The Afghanistan bit didn't, but it does relate to something that kept coming out of the conference. Which sort of shocked me, was how willing people were to talk about their failures, right? As commanders, to talk about where they got it wrong, what they learned from it. And following on from that was a thread that kept coming out was about creativity and imagination in our commanders and how we draw that out. There were some brilliant presentations that were not just about education. They were not just about the requirement to be able to debate and changing from a fluid to a crystallized mindset, but how we inculcate and breed creativity and imagination in our commanders, where we can escape some of those mistakes we made from just regurgitating the last man's campaign, right?
Well, it starts with a diverse group. It's hard to get creative if you're all the same. So we sometimes look at our group and then say, okay, that's the creative person in our group. But we then don't realize enough that we're actually a very non-diverse group. And I don't mean man and woman, I mean diversity of thought. And then within that group, you will find somebody who is a little bit more creative than the other. But it is really important that you get people from outside. And I think this was one of the things that came out of the conference as well. It's different from different nations, but also between the Navy and the Army and the Air Force and the Cyber Command. And between the construct even outside of the military, between industry and government. And we all have these different mindsets, which will put us in a way how we look at this problem set. So to start with, I think it would be really helpful, specifically if we're talking about the NATO level, to try to do everything to start. You don't have to get it perfect. Start to do things more multinational and try to do that in more things that you do to get more creativity and actually hear that there's perhaps other ways to look at the problem, and also there's other ways to come to solutions.
The really interesting stuff, I'm just flicking back through my notes, because when we're talking about getting more creative, there was this requirement to make people more uncomfortable, which I thought was great. There was a lovely saying by someone who said, it's about that disorientating dilemma that people need to have that makes them more creative. You have to break out of the sort of intellectual bubble in which you're in, which I thought was brilliant. It was one of those things, the panels got better and better, but we started off the conference, a lot of conversation about faster, increase the speed of the OODA loop, again, make it faster, pace is everything, and very little conversation about better in terms of decisions. And I think by the end of the second, maybe third day, we got to this thing where we were really just talking about better decisions. No one really cared about the faster, because we got to that stage, right, where we were talking about, well, better replace faster in every single piece of evidence that we saw, right? All the research, all the scientists, all they could bring us was this idea that better is the most important thing you get after, right?
I think it's really important to understand. That's a vital point, because we hear a lot that people will say, kill chain, and then you get into the tactical level for me. If you are thinking sensitive shooter, seconds decisions, yes, if we get to that realm in NATO, then we are in big trouble. Before that, if I think on the more operational level, you want to have a campaign. It's not something that you are doing in a second. It's not something that needs to be done in a day. It's more a direction and constantly looking at whether you are getting the effects that you want, and then looking back and trying to have an OODA loop on it and improve. And so you could have an argument or you could have a debate on those timelines. So when you are in the NATO headquarters, perhaps that would be a 2-week battle rhythm that they have, but that's already pretty fast. Maybe you should not make that a fixed timeline. Very complicated decisions probably take more time. You can't take all the time in the world. I have had a debate about what is an operational level decision. Can we try to get 2 examples of that? So I'm trying to talk to NATO senior mentors, but also to other people. So talk me through. You've been on this operational level. What would you have seen as really the decisions that you had to make on that? Or is it more the intent that you put out there and the campaign that you put out there? And it's hard to get a good answer on that. Of course, there's not one answer.
Right, and I'm not sure whether you think this slightly gets away from the conference, but I think it was inferred. And I can't resist asking the question. There seems to be a confusion about what the operational level is. In the hierarchy of military headquarters, and God knows how many there are, everyone wants to be at the operational level, whether you're a division, a corps. Is a corps at operational level? Should it be an army group? If you're a JFC, who is at the operational level? And frankly, I don't think anyone cares, except the people in the headquarters, right? For some reason, it's very important to them to be at the operational level. Is that one of the reasons? I mean, we avoided that. You constructed the conference in a way that we never talked about the strategic, operational and tactical level. Was that deliberate?
Yeah, a little bit. I won't get it right as well. I don't have it right. I don't have the answer. We don't have the answer. But it does show that there is a debate about it because we have misconception. We all think of the operational level in a different way. So I would just bring to bear that I think that at an operational level, probably it's more about priorities and on scarce resources and longer timelines. So if we look perhaps at Ukraine currently, they are planning for the spring offensive perhaps next year, because in reality, when it comes to logistics, things actually don't appear. So things do have timelines, and you need to set priorities and also to see effects of the things you are doing. That will also take time. So it's more of a level where you can get that. I think the operational level is really about getting that together. And that is not then a single decision on a single action. You're not really taking decisions on single actions. There will be multiple actions that come from your direction. And then you'll look at whether that is reaching an effect. And you prioritize where you would perhaps change your direction.
So we've got through a lot, but, and there were a huge number of themes. We started off the first day, there was a lot about mission command, right? And by the second day, we ditched the term mission command entirely. We're talking about degrees of delegation, where that sat naturally, where it sat right, how much you were retaining as a commander, when that was clearly wrong, linked to when you were making decisions as a commander, which were clearly wrong at the wrong level, and how uncomfortable you could be pushing that down. That stuff was great. The stuff about the best picture, the most situational awareness, the long screwdriver. As you'd expect, we had all these things. I don't want to launch into those now because there's going to be a conference report coming out. Where do the actions for this fall now? What happens to all that information that you took, that you drew out, the threads that are coming on? What happens with all that stuff now?
So we will continue with all of that, but not all at the same time. But it would be really important to stay in touch with the community and broaden the community, get people engaged, and have a continuous discussion on this. So we will come with a conference report, but we will also regularly update things on our website. We also really would like to tap into the national levels and the nations that have nodes that are really thinking about these things. They have the experience, they have the people that are really already far ahead sometimes, and link them together and have them to work with us together, support NATO in the best way we can. And so that would be really important for me to hand out, to get this engagement, as we are just a hub. I'd say it's impossible to.
Right, you've got a small team. You can't do it all. Yeah. Now, listen, we've skipped through loads of stuff. Are there any points that you wanted to bring out?
I think it's vital to rethink all the time. If you take a decision somewhere in some place, why are you taking that decision there? What is it about? So who do you need to take that decision? And then make it a little bit in military terms. We have defined all kinds of levels. We go from platoons to companies to brigades, divisions. But you must ask yourself what your specific level is adding to the decision. So do we still have that right? And with seamless connectivity and ways that we now can connect, you see that we already have this large screwdriver where somebody in the top could have the oversight and all this visibility, and they could be in Australia, perhaps. And so now, okay, that's a long stretch, but I would like people to think, how standoff can you take decisions? And also, where do you need to take what decisions, to define a little bit where your C2 nodes are, and what people you do need at those levels, and to think in multi-domain ways. So a little bit broader. Yeah, I think that is really vital. So what does your headquarter, if you have it, add to the decisions? And what decisions could have been pushed down and what should be perhaps somewhere else? And do you then have the connectivity and the connections? Are you already talking to everybody around you? And I'm not meaning the military people around you, but the governments, the industry, the people that will do the fortifications. Are you already engaged with them in order to do it in the best way you can as a headquarters?
Mietta, listen, thanks for joining us, putting us in the loop. We did a pretty amazing job over 3 days of beating ourselves up over NATO C2. And as someone pointed out right at the end, perhaps that's slightly unfair in comparison to our adversaries. As they said, you can't imagine the Russians and the Chinese having a similar discussion and welcoming a robust challenge for captains or NCOs. It's a really true point. Thanks for hosting us too, alongside the Canadian Joint Warfare Centre over the past 3 days. I think your team did a brilliant job. In the longer term, there'll be a conference report which we'll be signposting on the website and making sure people know about it, classification permitting. The show is sponsored by Systematic.
Citaware is the world's #1 force integration solution, providing full C4 ISR capability across the globe.
We hope you enjoyed the show. As well as telling your friends and colleagues about it, please do subscribe, leave us a review on any of your usual podcast streaming platforms. This really helps us to reach new audiences and to spread the word. The episode is produced by Aurelius Thinking as a show for the Wavell Room, the home of intellectual curiosity and challenging thinking for military professionals everywhere. Thanks for listening.